The air in Abernathy's mercantile was thick enough to drink. It tasted of dust, milled flour, and the slow certainty of ruin. It was August of 1874. Martha Evans stood at the counter, her daughter Lucy clutching a fold of her worn gingham dress. Between her thumb and forefinger, Martha held the last of it. A $10 bill, soft as old flannel from years of changing hands. It was all that stood between her and nothing at all. The heat outside did not care. It pressed on the town of Prairie Ridge with an indifferent weight, baking the soil into a cracked plate. Inside, Mr. Abernathy polished a glass jar with a grey rag, his movement slow and deliberate. He looked at the money, then at Martha, his gaze lingering on the desperation she tried so hard to hide. Behind him, stacked in rough wooden crates, was the source of it all. The sound was a frantic, high-pitched hum. A living vibration that filled the entire store. 342 of them, he said, not as a question. He had already counted. He had counted when they arrived on the morning freight, a shipment no one had claimed. A mistake. You mean to spend your last on a mistake? Martha's throat was dry. She could feel Lucy trembling beside her. She simply nodded. Mr. Abernathy stopped polishing the jar. He set it down with a soft click and leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, confidential rumble meant to sound like kindness. It was not kindness. A woman's sentiment is a poor substitute for a man's sense, Martha. That was the line. The final truth of her world, delivered in a quiet store that smelled of endings. She pushed the bill across the worn wood of the counter. The peeping from the crate seemed to get louder, a chorus of fragile, insistent life. It was a sound the whole town would soon come to know. Where are you watching from tonight? What sounds do you hear in the quiet places where you live? Let us know in the comments. We read them all. A year before the chickens, there was Thomas. Her husband was a man who listened to the land more than he listened to people. He believed a farm was a conversation, not a conquest. He left behind a small plot of land, a heavy debt at the bank, a 7-year-old daughter with his quiet eyes, and a small shelf of books. They were not storybooks. They were almanacs, agricultural pamphlets, and journals filled with his neat, blocky handwriting. While other widows in Prairie Ridge took in sewing or laundry, Martha took to reading. She read when she should have been sleeping, the kerosene lamp turning the pages yellow. She learned about soil composition, about the way planting beans next to corn could strengthen both. She learned that the phases of the moon were not superstition, but a calendar for planting root vegetables. The town saw a woman lost in grief, clinging to her husband's dusty papers. They did not see a mind at work. They saw a field of lettuce and cabbage, planted in strange, winding rows, and they shook their heads. It was not how a man would farm. It was not how anyone farmed. The rejection was not a single event, but a slow, steady pressure like water seeping into a foundation. It was in the way the other farmers offered to help by telling her to plow it all under and plant wheat. It was in the way the women from the church auxiliary brought by casseroles and pity, their eyes scanning her small cabin for signs of collapse. They believed they were being charitable. They could not imagine a world where she did not need their charity. The world had a category for a widow. It had a category for a farmer. It had no category for a woman who intended to be both. Reverend Miller, a man whose hands were soft and whose certainty was hard, encapsulated the town's opinion from the pulpit one Sunday. He did not use her name. He did not have to. Grief makes a mind wander, friends, he intoned, his voice filling the small, hot church. It can lead one to peculiar notions, to experiments that fly in the face of good sense and tradition. We must pray for clarity for those so afflicted. Martha sat in the back pew, Lucy's head on her shoulder, and felt the words settle over her. Peculiar notions. They thought her study was a symptom. They thought her careful observation was madness born of loss. They did not understand that for her, it was the only thing that felt like sense. Thomas was gone. The land was all that was left of him, and she intended to understand its language. The banknote was due after the fall harvest. One season. That was all she had to prove that her peculiar notions could pay a man's debt. That was the reality that pushed her into Abernathy's mercantile in August, to spend the last of her money on a shipment of unclaimed, day-old chicks. It was not sentiment. It was a calculation. A desperate one. The first week was a lesson in the tyranny of the small. 342 lives, each no bigger than a child's fist, each a tiny engine of need. The sound was constant. A high, ceaseless peeping that permeated the walls of the cabin, the fabric of her dress, the quiet of her own thoughts. It was the sound of fragility. A draught of cold air, a moment of unclean water, a shadow of a hawk overhead, any of these could extinguish dozens of them in an instant. Her body learned a new rhythm, one dictated by the sun and the frantic demands of the chicks. Before dawn, she was out in the small barn, her fingers, already calloused from fieldwork, fumbling with the latch. The smell hit her first, a sharp, pungent mix of pine shavings, feed, and life. She built makeshift brooders from old packing crates, lining them with straw and hanging a single, precious lantern in each to ward off the chill of the plains night. She hauled water in buckets that made her shoulders ache, her arms feel stretched and thin. She ground corn into a rough mash, her hands stained yellow with the dust. Sleep became a series of stolen moments. She would doze in a chair by the stove, her head nodding forward, only to be jerked awake by a change in the tenor of the peeping, a sign of distress. Her fingers went from sore to raw to numb, crisscrossed with 100 tiny scratches from hastily assembled wire mesh. The dizziness came in the afternoons, a light-headedness that forced her to sit on the cool dirt floor of the barn, her head between her knees, just to keep the world from tilting. One night, the third or fourth, she lay on her thin mattress, Lucy asleep beside her. The peeping from the barn was a solid wall of sound. It was no longer the sound of life. It was the sound of her own folly. Abernathy's words echoed in the dark. A woman's sentiment. Reverend Miller's prayer for her clarity. They were right. She had traded her daughter's security for a barn full of noise and death. She thought about the warm, lumpy oatmeal they ate every morning. She thought about how simple it would be to just walk away. To take Lucy to the next town, find work as a laundress, a scullery maid. To disappear into a life of anonymous hardship instead of this very public failure. This was where her story could end. In a small cabin, listening to the sound of her last, worst mistake. She closed her eyes and considered the relief of surrender. Then, a different sound cut through the peeping. A low growl, then a scratch at the barn door. A fox. The body acts before the mind catches up. Martha was on her feet, the exhaustion forgotten, a cold purpose washing over her. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the stove and was out the door without a thought. She did not make a sound. She stood in the dark, the poker held tight in her hand, until the scratching stopped and the shadow melted back into the night. She stayed there for a long time, the cool night air on her face. When she finally went back inside, she did not go to bed. She lit the lamp and pulled one of Thomas's journals from the shelf. Her hands were shaking slightly. She opened it to a page she had read a dozen times. His handwriting was a comfort. He wrote about crop rotation, about soil health. And there, at the bottom of a page, a short, underlined sentence she had passed over before. Poultry are the sanitation core of a functional farm. They convert pestilence into protein. Pestilence into protein. It was not a miracle. It was not a voice from the heavens. It was a practical sentence written by a practical man. But in that moment, it felt like permission. It felt like a map. The next morning, she watched the chicks with new eyes. She had penned them in a small run beside the barn. A large, black beetle scuttled across the dirt. In a blink, a wave of yellow fluff descended on it. A tiny, ferocious swarm. They tore it apart. She tossed in a caterpillar she plucked from a cabbage leaf. The same frantic, efficient consumption. She did not feel relief. Relief is a soft emotion. This was something harder, something with an edge. It was recognition. She knelt in the dirt, the sun warming her back, and watched them strip a patch of ground clean of every insect, every weed shoot. She felt something she had no word for. It was not joy. It was the quiet, solid feeling of a key turning in a lock. She had not bought 342 mouths to feed. She had bought 342 soldiers for the war she was in. And the enemy was coming. The building began not with a plan, but with a problem. The chicks, growing at a startling rate, were turning their small run into a patch of barren, foul-smelling earth. To keep them healthy, they needed fresh ground. To keep her crops safe, they needed to be contained. The solution came from Thomas's journals and her own observations. She would build them houses that could move. She used scrap lumber from a collapsed shed, boards warped and grey with age. She pulled rusty nails from them one by one, straightening them on a flat stone. She found a roll of chicken wire left in the barn, a forgotten purchase of Thomas's, and spent days cutting it with a pair of tin snips that made her hands cramp and bleed. The result was 2 large, flawless pens, heavy and awkward. They were not elegant. But they were functional. She called them her chicken tractors. Every few days, she and Lucy would wrestle one of the pens to a new patch of ground. They would push and pull, their feet digging into the soil, moving it a few feet at a time. The chickens would pour onto the fresh earth, a chattering, scratching wave, and begin their work. They devoured insects, grubs, and weed seeds. They tilled the soil with their scratching. They fertilized it as they went. Martha began to see her farm not as a single field, but as a system, a cycle. The chickens prepared the ground where next season's crops would grow. The crops, in turn, would provide sustenance. It was a circle of labor and reward. The first proof came in late September. The other farms in the valley were already fighting the first wave of pests. Cabbage worms and flea beetles were chewing through their neat, traditional rows. Whispers of a bad year were starting in town. But Martha's fields were different. Her lettuces were crisp and whole, the cabbages forming tight, perfect heads. The leaves were a deep, healthy green, unmarred by the ragged holes that plagued her neighbors' plants. The chickens, contained in their movable pens at the field's edge, formed a living perimeter. They were a vigilant, hungry border patrol. This was the first proof. Not a single head of prize-winning cabbage, but 100 rows of them, thriving and clean. It was a quiet, undeniable fact, growing right out of the ground. An ally arrived not with a declaration, but with a small cloth bundle. Beatrice was a woman who lived at the edge of town, in a small house the children said was haunted. The community saw her as a recluse, a bit strange. She kept to herself, gathering herbs in the hills. One afternoon, she appeared at the edge of Martha's property. She had seen one of the chickens limping. Without a word, she opened her bundle and produced a green, fragrant poultice. She showed Martha how to apply it to the chicken's swollen leg. Beatrice did not offer advice about the farm. She did not comment on the strangeness of Martha's methods. She simply watched, her gaze taking in the movable pens, the healthy crops, the constant activity. "My grandmother did something like this," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. She called it letting the animals do the work. The old ways of in that moment, Martha felt a kinship she had not realized she was missing. It was not praise. It was recognition from someone who understood the language of the land. Beatrice started visiting once a week, bringing wild greens the chickens could eat and sharing knowledge that was not found in any of Thomas's books. The community, however, remained skeptical. Mr. Abernathy would raise an eyebrow when she came to buy grain, a small smirk playing on his lips. "Still feeding that flock of yours, Martha?" The question was casual, but the meaning was clear. "You are still pouring good money after bad." The whispers about Martha's folly grew louder. The smell, the noise, the sheer strangeness of it all. It confirmed what they already believed, the poor woman had been unmoored by grief. Then, in the first week of October, the sky began to hum. It started as a low thrumming, a vibration felt in the teeth more than heard with the ears. It grew steadily, a sound like a distant, unending train. It was the grasshoppers. They came not as a swarm, but as a brown, living cloud that blotted out the afternoon sun. They settled on the valley, and the sound changed from a hum to a collective, deafening crackle. The sound of millions of jaws, chewing. Fields of late-season corn were reduced to stalks in an hour. Wheat fields vanished, leaving only dust. The town watched in horror as a year's work was consumed. Panic set in. But the cloud, the devouring wave, seemed to break and part around one small farm. Martha's farm. A group of men, their faces grim, walked to the edge of her property. Abernathy was there. So was Reverend Miller. They stood at her fence line, silent. On their side, desolation. Ruined fields, stripped bare. On her side, a vibrant, shocking green. And in the space between her rows of cabbage, and all around the perimeter of her fields, was her army. 342 chickens, now nearly grown, feasting. They ran through the grass, leaping into the air, snapping the insects out of the sky. The air over her land was filled not with the crackle of devastation, but with the frantic, joyful noise of a banquet. The men did not speak. They just watched the chickens eat the plague. The day after the grasshoppers had passed, leaving the rest of the valley looking like it had been scoured by fire, a knock came at Martha's door. It was Mr. Abernathy. He was not the man she had faced across the mercantile counter. That man had been solid, certain, his world built on ledgers and predictable transactions. This man was diminished. The certainty had gone out of him, leaving his shoulders slumped, his eyes tired. He held his hat in his hands, turning the brim over and over. He did not look at her directly at first. His gaze fell on a row of perfect cabbages near the porch. He cleared his throat. The town needs to eat, Martha. It was not an apology. It was a statement of fact. A surrender. His own store was full of flour and sugar and coffee, but those were luxuries. The staples, the food that would get people through the winter, had been chewed into the dirt. All except hers. He was asking her to save the town that had ridiculed her. Martha looked past him, at her daughter Lucy, who was watching from the doorway, her small face serious. She felt the weight of that August afternoon, the sting of his words. She could have said 1,000 things. She could have reminded him of his dismissal, of his certainty in her failure. She did not. The victory was the field of green behind her. It needed no commentary. Her response was a logistical question, calm and direct. How many wagons do you have? My cart can only hold so much. The next week, her small farm became the center of the town's survival. She sold her produce to Abernathy on credit, knowing it might be months before she saw $1. She did not haggle. She set a fair price and filled every crate and barrel he brought. People who had whispered about Martha's folly now lined up for her cabbages, their faces a mixture of shame and desperate gratitude. The acknowledgement, when it came, was as quiet as the judgment had been loud. A month later, Martha went to the mercantile to buy kerosene. Abernathy was behind the counter. He finished with his customer and then turned to her. He didn't speak. He simply opened his large, leather-bound ledger, the one that held all the town's debts. He turned to the page under Evans, where the last of Thomas's debt was recorded. He picked up his pen, dipped it in the inkwell, and drew 2 clean, dark lines through the remaining balance. He blotted the ink, closed the book, and pushed it back onto the shelf. He gave her a short, sharp nod, and then turned to arrange a display of canned peaches. The debt was gone. That was the apology. It was more than enough. Years passed. The farm grew. Lucy grew with it, learning the rhythms of the land, the language of the chickens. One afternoon, Beatrice sat with Martha on the porch, watching the flock forage in a newly harvested field. "You ever forgive them?" Beatrice asked, her voice soft. "For the way they were." Martha was shelling peas, her thumb splitting the pods with practiced ease. She looked out at the town, at the smoke curling from the chimneys. "There's too much work to do to carry that, too," she said. She died in that same chair, on a warm spring evening decades later. She was an old woman, her hands gnarled but her eyes clear. Her daughter, Lucy, was running the farm now, with her own husband and children. The farm was famous in the territory, a model of sustainable agriculture that people came from 2 counties away to study. In Martha's lap was a small cloth bag filled with saved seeds from the previous year's harvest. She closed her eyes, listening to the familiar, comforting sound of hundreds of chickens clucking in the twilight, the descendants of the original 342. She looked like a person who had just finished a long and satisfying book. Her method fed Prairie Ridge through a second grasshopper plague in '78 and a brutal drought 2 years after that. She trained 17 other farmers in her system of poultry integration, changing the way the entire valley thought about the relationship between animals and crops. The farm she started on a prayer and a $10 bill fed the town for 3 generations. Her headstone, in the small churchyard where Reverend Miller once preached about her peculiar notions, is simple. It was carved by her son-in-law, and it reads, Martha Evans. She kept the land. What is the thing everyone calls your folly? The $10 risk that feels like it could break you? What is the gift you possess, the quiet knowledge the world has no category for yet? Perhaps you have been standing on the edge of your own field, listening for the sound of the coming plague, not realizing you have been cultivating the answer all along. The world is full of sealed doors and dismissed ideas. Perhaps it is time to turn the key. That frantic peeping in a hot storeroom in 1874 was not the sound of a foolish woman's last dollar being wasted. It was the sound of a solution nobody else had the wisdom to hear. True resilience is not about enduring the plague that comes for you. It is about quietly cultivating the one thing that can devour it. If you believe in the magnificent power of the overlooked, subscribe for more stories of those who built a future no one else could see.